All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Darren Ranaletti. I'm the Assistant Director for Housing and Local Planning here at MTC and ABAG. How is that? Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you. So again, my name is Darren Ranaletti. I'm the Assistant Director for Housing and Local Planning here at MTC and ABAG. And as President Ramos said, I'm here to provide a early sneak peek of the upcoming 7th cycle of the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA process. The process won't really start in earnest until next year, but given regional interest, we've decided to give this early preview here today, and it's similar to a presentation that we gave to the ABAG Executive Board last month. I'll start by providing a basic overview of RHNA, and then I'll cover some specific topics, including the allocation methodology, subregions, and recent changes to RHNA law. Next slide, please. So what is RHNA? RHNA is a component of the state of California's housing planning system. State housing law requires all jurisdictions to meet local housing needs. The process involves the state determining the number of housing units needed in the region for people at all income levels. Then ABAG allocates those housing units to each jurisdiction in the region. And finally, local jurisdictions update the housing element of the general plan to accommodate those allocated housing units. Next slide. The objectives of RHNA are contained in state law and are summarized here. Increase housing supply, mix, and affordability equitably. Promote infill development, efficient growth patterns, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Improve the jobs housing balance, particularly for low-wage workers. Address disproportionate income distributions across jurisdictions. And affirmatively further fair housing, which means preventing segregation and poverty concentration, as well as increasing access to areas of opportunity. Next slide. The RHNA process can be broken down into 5 steps. The first step involves the Regional Housing Need Determination, or RHND. That's distributed by the Department of Housing and Community Development and includes the number of housing units by affordability level to be accommodated in the region. The second step involves ABAG developing a draft methodology to allocate the RHND to local jurisdictions. The third step involves ABAG submitting the draft methodology to HCD for approval, and then once approved, issuing draft allocations to local jurisdictions. Next slide. In step 4, HCD and local jurisdictions have an opportunity to appeal draft allocations. ABAG holds a public hearing and acts on the appeals based on the parameters that are laid out in state law, and then it issues final allocations to local jurisdictions. And finally, in step 5, local jurisdictions update their housing elements to accommodate the allocated number of units. Next slide, please. ABAG's primary role in the RHNA process is determining the methodology to allocate the RHND to local jurisdictions. The methodology is a formula that distributes the housing units to the region based on factors that must be considered under state law. ABAG staff engage with local jurisdictions for input on the methodology and convene a housing methodology committee that's comprised of local elected officials, jurisdiction staff, and regional stakeholders. The committee plays an important role in developing the methodology. Next slide. State law allows local jurisdictions to form subregions to conduct their own local allocation process to distribute housing units to their participating jurisdictions. In the standard regional process, the state provides the RHND to ABAG, which develops a methodology to distribute the housing units to jurisdictions in the region. But in the sub-region process, the state issues the RHND, and ABAG provides the sub-region share to the sub-region. Then the sub-region conducts its own process to allocate the housing units to the jurisdictions that are participating in the sub-region. Next slide. The requirements for sub-regions are contained in state law. They may be any combination of local governments as long as they are geographically contiguous and contain the unincorporated county. Subregions are responsible for much of the same requirements related to the allocation process. They must develop their own methodology and allocation that's consistent with state requirements, and they must conduct and resolve any appeals that are filed by local jurisdictions. In the Bay Area, subregions have formed in each of the 3 previous RHNA cycles. San Mateo County formed a subregion in Cycle 5. Napa, San Mateo, and Solano counties each formed a subregion in Cycle, San Mateo was Cycle 4, and then those counties were Cycle 5, and then Solano County formed one during the last cycle, Cycle 6. Next slide, please. There can be benefits to forming a subregion. It can foster collaboration amongst jurisdictions. It can help facilitate dialogue on housing issues, and it allows allocations to be more tailored to local context. And it promotes alignment between local and regional needs. Next slide. In addition to benefits, there can be some challenges that come along with forming a subregion. Subregions are subject to significant scrutiny and oversight by the state. They can require substantial resources and staff time, and there's always the potential that the participating jurisdictions just don't agree. Next slide. If we look back at the last RHNA cycle, Cycle 6, there are some important lessons learned. The Housing Methodology Committee was effective. Regular communication was important. The appeals process was efficient but time-consuming. ABAG was able to provide valuable support to jurisdictions to update their housing element, which resulted in 99% of the region with a certified housing element. Next slide, please. If we look at the RHNA process, it's important to be aware of some common misconceptions. The state determines the total RHND number for the region, not ABAG. ABAG determines where housing is allocated in the region, but then local jurisdictions determine where housing is planned in their communities. When it comes to appeals, ABAG actually has a narrow statutory authority for deciding those appeals. It's also important to keep in mind that RHNA is only one component of housing elements, which must address housing needs more broadly than just identifying new sites for housing. And finally, this is something that we get asked about a lot. ABAG doesn't enforce housing element requirements. That's the responsibility of the state. Next slide. So there's been some important changes to RHNA law since the last cycle, so I'm going to spend a few moments going over what those changes are on the next slides. Next slide, please. So first change is that the state will provide the RHND 1 year earlier than previous cycles. That means 3 years before the housing elements are due instead of 2. So this year it will be issued by January 31st, 2028. Next slide. The state must now consider homelessness as it develops the RHND. HCD is required to consult with ABAG on the methodology for considering that. This change could result in increasing the RHND for the region. Next slide. Key change number 3. There's been a change to how the state considers housing cost burden and overcrowding in the region. This is a bit of a technical detail, but it could have an important effect. The state previously compared rates in the Bay Area to rates of similar regions in the country, but now it will compare the rates of cost burden and overcrowding to national averages. It's possible that this too will result in the RHND number increasing for the Bay Area. Next slide. Both the RHND and RHNA must now consider two new income categories: acutely low income and extremely low income. Households with these incomes were previously grouped together with the very low income household category, but now they will be separated out into their own categories this cycle. Next slide. The RHNA allocation methodology must now consider constraints related to climate change, such as evacuation route capacity, wildfire risk, and sea level rise. These issues will be considered alongside other factors that are required by state law. Next slide. And finally, there's an important change related to how allocations are made to subregions. State law now requires that the allocation to a subregion be the same proportion as the subregion share of the RHNA allocation from the previous cycle. So, for example, if the participating jurisdictions in a subregion this cycle received 5% of the previous RHND from the last cycle, this cycle the subregion would receive 5% of the new RHND. This could enable subregions to receive their subregion allocation sooner in the process compared to previous cycles. Next slide. So there's two important considerations to keep in mind as we head into the next RHNA process. Due to changes in state law, the RHND, or the regional number for the Bay Area, may in fact be larger than last cycle. The RHND for the last cycle was already a substantial increase over previous cycles. ABAG and local jurisdictions should be prepared for an even larger RHND, which could result then in larger allocations to local jurisdictions. In terms of the allocation timeline, the process will benefit from having the RHND issued 1 year earlier this cycle compared to previous cycles. In previous cycles, the process to develop the methodology would have to start before the RHND was issued, so this required the Housing Methodology Committee to consider factors to allocate a hypothetical regional number that was then substituted for the actual RHND once it was issued. Since the RHND will be issued earlier this year, it would allow for a more straightforward linear process. Next slide. As I mentioned previously, ABAG was able to provide robust support to local jurisdictions for housing elements during the last cycle. ABAG's Regional Housing Technical Assistance Program was supported by one-time funding from the State Regional Early Action Planning Program, or REAP program. This enabled ABAG to financially support county planning collaboratives, provide technical assistance, and create data tools that help jurisdictions meet housing element requirements. Unfortunately, the state's REAP program is scheduled to end at the end of 2026. As a result, ABAG technical assistance may be more limited this cycle due to funding constraints. Available funding for this work is still being determined, and ABAG continues to advocate for continued funding from the state. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the final slide. This is the timeline for the process. ABAG will consult with HCD on the RHND beginning late next year. At the same time, work will begin with the Housing Methodology Committee to develop the proposed methodology. That will last approximately 1 year until late 2028. We expect to receive the RHND in early 2028. Subregions should form around that same time. Then a year later, in 2029, ABAG will submit the draft methodology to HCD for approval. In mid-2029, ABAG will adopt the final methodology and issue draft allocations to jurisdictions. Appeals would be heard shortly thereafter, and the statutory deadline to adopt the final RHNA plan is January 31st, 2030, and local housing elements are due to the state by January 31st, 2031. When we presented this timeline to the ABAG Executive Board in May, we heard feedback that jurisdictions would benefit greatly from receiving their RHNA allocation earlier. We're exploring ways to accelerate that timeline, such as starting the Housing Methodology Committee sooner or reducing the amount of time that it takes to develop the methodology. These changes could speed up the process, but there's important trade-offs that we're currently looking into. We're interested in providing the allocations as quick as possible while still meeting statutory requirements and conducting a deliberative and effective regional process. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Break over. Cool. Excellent. Thank you so much, and I really do think this is a great opportunity for us, as questions arise, and certainly the number coming we know is going to be larger, and we really appreciate your sharing your expertise and kind of giving us a recap of where we've been and where we're going. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for general member discussion. And so I'm going to ask, can I have staff with microphones? Maybe we can meet them, so I'm not going to treat you like public. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for that report. I have a general question about the 5%. And thinking about Cycle 6, both voter-approved growth limit lines and wildfire risk areas and sea level rise were not taken into account during Cycle 6. However, wildfire risk and sea level rise will be taken into account on this next cycle. How would you treat a jurisdiction that has voter-approved growth limit lines, and also that maybe had a different percentage of the allocation, and 5% might be unfair because of those other risk factors that were not taken into account?
Good morning, I'm Dave Vaughton, Planning Director, and I'll start answering your question, and Darren can chime in as well. I jumped in here because I worked on the Cycle 6 RHNA with some of our colleagues as well. So just for a little bit of context, the methodology for the last RHNA cycle did rely on Plan Bay area as an input, which did incorporate some considerations for wildfire, urban growth boundaries, and sea level rise. What's new this time is just really doubling down in that space, right? The HMC ultimately last time didn't incorporate specific factors related to resilience. That could be a new addition that would further strengthen those ties. So that's something that the HMC will have to really thoughtfully consider, especially given what you heard Darren present on this morning with the changes in state law.
Next question right here, and then I'll go to Supervisor Rabbit.
Hi there, Stephanie Hellman, Town of Fairfax. Could you just expand with regard to the evacuation rate? When you say consideration, what does that mean? And what group and what organization is focused on this right now?
So the state law outlines a long list of development constraints that are required to look at. And so now evacuation route capacity has been added, but it isn't defined or clarified or expanded upon. So that's something that, as part of the process, we'll be looking at what does that mean, and how could that be considered in the allocation process.
So what emergency organizations will you be working with on that?
So
I'm trying to hone in on, because the fire maps was an issue last cycle, so I'd like to understand what sources you're using moving forward and who you're bringing to the table from an expertise standpoint.
Yeah, great question. So RHNA law actually requires that we have a public process. So there will be a public participation process. Part of that is through the Housing Methodology Committee that I mentioned before, that is comprised of staff from local jurisdictions, local elected officials, regional stakeholders, as well as subject matter experts. So that is a list that will be generated, and the executive board we'll review that list to see if the parameters in state law are adequately reflected, and then we have an opportunity to go beyond that. So it's certainly something that we can do in terms of reaching out to additional folks if they're not on that body itself. So we don't have a list yet, but it's certainly something that we want to work with the region and the executive board to develop.
And so, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just really trying to get the information that my constituents are requiring of me. So is that your organization that's accountable for pulling in the right experts, or is it HCD?
So the evacuation route capacity is a factor that ABAG needs to consider when it does the RHNA process. So ABAG is responsible for conducting that process.
Okay. And is that your group?
Yes. So we have a no problem. We have a staff team that work on the project in conjunction, with the ABAG executive board and the public. So it's a public process.
Okay. I know it's a public process. What I'm really trying to hone in on, what emergency organizations that have that kind of evacuation expertise are you gonna pull in before it's said and done?
I think it's a great question. I kind of would point to the slide here, which, that process, we're giving this preview is very early in the process. You can see between fall 2027 and fall 2028, we'll be bringing all those stakeholders to the table and having that process. So it's an excellent question. We just haven't gotten there yet because the process will kick off a year from now.
Downstream. I really want to make sure that that's noted. Thank you so much.
To help out staff on this one, I think a lot of that comes down to your executive board and what your executive board is asking of the methodology committee, and to make those recommendations. I certainly know that it's going to be someone from my OES team or even our fire chief that would be involved in really being able to outline what that is for those counties. And each of us, we all think we're special, and you really are. But there are some of our counties that have been from Napa, that have far more experience on, in fact, what is an evacuation route, and also what is a fire-prone area. And so with the mapping changes that happen with CAL FIRE and changing the state responsibility area and the fire severity zones, those are all considerations that have been at the forefront of the discussions that we're having at the executive board, and in fact came up during the last appeal cycle, which is why, in some respects, while I don't like some of the things that are being imposed upon us, it is good that that is in fact part of the consideration, because that guidance gives us a greater, as best as the state can be clear with us, gives us some better clarity on where to go. Supervisor Abbott.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Darren and Dave, for all your work. Appreciate it. Can you expand a little further on the sub-region approach? I personally are in the sixth cycle. I think for Sonoma County, the numbers went up over 600%, and I'm glad that there's the extra year, because you'll have the number as you do the methodology, because we were doing it in the hypothetical way, and I could only imagine that everyone said, "Oh, wait a minute, I didn't know the number was going to be that high. Let's rethink this," and it was too late. I've always thought and we tried to form a sub-region, but our cities, without the number perhaps in hand, said no. And I do think that if you are looking for a more granular approach to allocating housing, a sub-region is the way to go, because you're given that one large number and then you just sit down, counties and cities all sit down and figure it out. So it takes away some of that regional stigma or even the state mandated stigma. Can you talk about a little further about the pros and cons of sub-regional approach? You mentioned additional scrutiny from the state. I take it that's just because ABAG's not the direct one getting scrutinized. Anything else that we should know, and just, is this something that we should encourage? Because it seems to me that, again, a county or a city may have different circumstances that could be accommodated by sitting down locally and figuring it out together.
Great question. Yeah, I think there's pros and cons, like what was on the slides. And feel free to talk to folks who have been through it in the past to get their impressions. One thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that there's a whole rigorous process to forming the subregion. So each local jurisdiction needs to adopt a local resolution. The ABAG Executive Board needs to adopt a resolution. There needs to be a memorandum of understanding. Subregions typically then have some type of governance. So who's the board and who's going to convene it, and how are the votes going to happen. So because all that needs to happen, I think one thing we really want to press upon the Assembly today, and why we're here early, is to start thinking about it and talking to folks. Even though it says subregions form early 2028, given what I just described, I would say start talking, later this year, early next year, with your neighboring jurisdictions.
We'll stick over on this side. Thank you for holding your hands up.
All right.
We'll weave around.
Well, first, thank you very much for the presentation. It's extremely helpful to have this look ahead. But as we begin to approach the end of Cycle 6, if a jurisdiction is in the fortunate position of officials believing they might exceed Cycle 6 numbers, I've begun to hear rumblings that they might want to slow things down so they can preserve those units for Cycle 7, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to have happen here. So do you think are there any thoughts on perhaps giving credit for units that are built in the last year or two of 6? I mean, I just don't want to see that incentive play out, and so I'm wondering if there's any thinking as to how to avoid that.
Great question. State law actually precludes us from taking into account past production. We're interested in hearing about that. So we do annual reports on RHNA progress. We're planning to do one to the executive board this fall, so we can get a sense of where folks are at. If there are cases where folks are slowing down, so to speak, I think it'd be something that we would be interested in learning about, and seeing if there's any way that that can, be successful for both the jurisdiction and the process. So it's a good point.
Thank you. We'll go to a lady who reminded me about public comment right there. Blue suit. Right there. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Rabbit, for putting that comment about subregions. I echo that seems like a reasonable idea for us to pursue this cycle, so thank you. On the wildfire, I do gently want to push back about the appeal process for ABAG for the wildfire and evacuation regions, because we did have our appeal last time based on that, and it was denied. And basically, you guys went back and ruled that we're not going to actually consider those regions as part of your allocations. So hoping that now state law is coming in and this next cycle, it will be considered, because I think we know a lot more about it now and understand it better. And for the person asking about how are you studying the evacuation routes, every year each city does have to submit to the state your your evacuation areas that only have single ingress and egress. So each city actually does already send that to the state, and I hope that ABAG will be using that as part of the criteria, because our city is 50% limited. And so that data is available from every city already.
Thank you. We'll move on to right here with the slightly pink glasses, and that's not you, sir. That's behind Lisa. Thank you. And if you would tell us, introduce yourselves, like, we don't know everyone.
My name's Jane Cooper, and I'm
Hi,
a city
Jane.
council member from Belvedere, which is where Tiburon is. 'Cause
Yeah.
nobody knows where Belvedere is. So.
I do. I do.
And there's a reason. It's because we're a half a square mile of land. So anyway, we have a huge number that we were given based on number, the fifth element. And what my question kind of follows up with the woman before asking about element 6, and that is the opposite. If our communities are not meeting the units at the halfway point, I will also say that we barely got into your 99% certification because I think we've been certified for 5 months now. So, and now that we're finally certified, we're expected to meet all these numbers. So I'm not going to say we won't, but if we don't, and I'm assuming many other communities in the Bay Area will not meet the numbers, is any of that going to be taken into consideration? Is there any plan? Do you know what's happening if you're at the halfway point and you haven't met your numbers? There's been a lot talked about consequences, and so it's wonderful to hear about 7, but I'm kind of curious about what's happening in 6.
Great question. Thanks. In terms of looking forward, I'll go back to 6, but in terms of looking forward to 7, just as I mentioned previously, overproduction or underproduction isn't something that's taken into account for the next RHNA allocation. But for this current cycle, the consequences of not meeting those numbers, and a reminder that the RHNA law requires local jurisdictions to plan for the housing, not to build the housing, but there is a relatively new consequence to not meeting those numbers. And that's when the state looks at that production progress at the midway point, which is coming up in the next year or so. And if you are not meeting certain categories, then there are certain streamlining provisions of state law that kick in that enable that reduce the discretion that cities have when they're reviewing and approving certain types of development projects.
Thank you. We'll go here in the front, then we'll go over.
Yeah, thank you very much for the discussion, the presentation. I'm Jeff Nybert, council member from Pleasanton. And of course, you alluded to all the acrimony and dissatisfaction among our cities of the allocations made by ABAG in the last cycle. Well, in fact, there remains a significant lack of trust in how HCD produces the numbers that they hand off to ABAG. And the huge problem is the lack of transparency in the RHND calculation from the very beginning of the process at the state level. The first step at the state level is the Department of Finance handing over to HCD the numbers that form the basis of the RHND. So whether in a region or a sub-region, any member of the public should have access as the process occurs in real time to the release of the Department of Finance numbers, as well as the complete process by which HCD calculates the RHND. My request would be that ABAG needs to, for its part, check and confirm the accuracy of the RHND it receives from HCD well before the allocation to cities. And this would go a long way to avoiding the acrimony we saw in Cycle 6. And I'd ask ABAG to discuss and commit to doing this.
I'll go ahead and take that one. Very valid point, and points that we've had, points we've had at the executive board and also at the joint legislation committee with ABAG and MTC. I agree, to a certain extent, it's like HCD doesn't have topography maps, right? Like they don't know what's a hill, what's a valley, what's defined as high resource areas, is very skewed based upon just simple finance data as opposed to actual the actual ability to implement increased housing in those areas. So that is something that we've discussed extensively at the legislation committee as to what those numbers mean on the front end. I can tell you, I am this organization's representative on CalCog, which is the California Council of Governments. We are made up of a bunch of cogs like this, but we're a nonprofit, so that gives us a little bit of flexibility in terms of how we advocate, and we are having those discussions at the state level. It's important to all. I mean, we're not unique in that sense. The SCAG, the Southern California region, SANDAG, San Diego region, same thing. Central Valley, same thing. It's for us, when we look at it, I think what I will say is the real changes really come with the additional considerations this time. That's really where we're going to see a lot of impact. We continue to have staff and executive committee direct staff to engage with HCD. I think we all want more out of HCD in that process, for sure. I think what we're really saying here is we are bracing ourselves for what's coming and being able to provide as much lead time as possible to be able to work through that methodology. As far as the mapping that goes into consideration of high resource areas influences HCD, Department of Finance influences HCD, and really those numbers that you see present in Bay Area 2060 plus in terms of growth forecasts are different from those finance numbers. And so how we reconcile that, and those are conversations that we have had about how we have that true up. Ultimately, it is on the radar of the joint legislation committees to ensure that we are increasing transparency and really fairness, right? I mean, fairness to you as a city is going to be different than fairness to me as a county, and we recognize that. But as a region, putting our regional hats on, that is a goal that we have. Anything to add?
Interestingly, in 2022, the state auditor audited HCD and the RHNA process, and there were two key shortcomings that were identified around documentation of information and the analysis in their methodology. So a whole series of recommendations came out of that. So under state RHNA law, we have the authority to consult with HC directly about that when they develop the RHND. So we're hopeful this time, given those reforms that came out of the audit and our ability to consult with HCD, that we will have a higher level of transparency and trust compared to the last cycle.
Excellent. Other City of Martinez, right?
Yes.
Cool.
Thank you. Good memory. Thank you. Hi. Satinder Malhi, Vice Mayor, City of Martinez. Thank you all very much for the informative presentation. So just a couple of quick comments and then a question, if I may. Definitely appreciate that HCD is now issuing the RHND 1 year earlier, but did want to put forward to see if there could be some consideration given so that jurisdictions such as ours have 1.5 years rather than just 1 year to adopt our final housing element after the final RHNA adoption by ABAG. The other question, though, that I had was with respect to the Housing Methodology Committee. Forgive me if I may have missed this, but is this committee already in existence, or is it in the process of being created? And if so, is there an opportunity for jurisdictions such as ours to be represented as part of that process? And if so, is that limited to just delegates, or can we have our city staff participate in that process somehow? So thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. As mentioned in the presentation, the HMC was fairly successful in the last cycle at creating space for dialogue. And it is not a standing organization. We stand it up for each RHNA cycle. So given this schedule, in 2027, the ABAG Executive Board would form that body. Traditionally, it has included elected officials, local planning staff or local planning directors, as well as nonprofit advocacy organizations to try to bring all those folks to the table. That committee advises the ABAG board on what the methodology could be. So there's going to be time next year to really for the board to grapple with that, determine who those nominees are, make sure that all cities, counties, all corners of the region are reflected on that body. So that is upcoming next year.
On the first point, I think that's a great one. We're trying to get the allocation numbers to the local jurisdictions as quick as possible. We are, as I said in this presentation, looking for ways to speed up that process, making sure that we're not, cutting corners and having a thorough vetting with the region and the public. I will say that, as I mentioned in the presentation, that the allocation is one component of housing elements, but jurisdictions don't need to wait until they receive the allocation to start their housing elements. In fact, it'd be good to start thinking about development sites, housing needs. We'll be issuing, hopefully, technical assistance to help folks get started with that. Some folks are able to do that in-house. Some folks will procure consultant services to do that. So there's work that can happen before the RHNA allocation is made.
Other, right here in the front.
Hi, Rajiv Bateja. I'm the mayor of Los Altos Hills. First of all, I want to thank you for the presentation. It's always good to know well in advance when you have a painful medical procedure in your future. So. I have two questions. I'm going to ask them, I'm going to try and explain them a little bit because I'm not very good at this. How much is the effect of transit infrastructure and the diversity of zoning or parcel types? How much is that considered when you're allocating a number to a jurisdiction?
So the state law lists the factors that must be considered. It does allow ABAG to consider other factors as long as they're not inconsistent with the objectives of RHNA. One of the listed factors is transportation and transit, so that is something that will be considered. And then the ABAG has the ability to consider other factors as well.
So infrastructure is possible. Is that one of the factors too, like availability of, sewer or?
Yes, utility availability is one of the required factors to be considered.
How about the diversity of parcel types? So for example, if a city has a lot of commercial or industrial that maybe is evolving or not in use, does that sort of merit?
Yeah, great question. I think this raises why the process to develop the methodology takes some time because there's so many things to think about. You mentioned industrial and commercial. We are required to take into account jobs. Okay, so that's important. But in terms of parcel size or configuration, that isn't listed. So it could be something that's considered as long as the result of that is not counter to the objectives of RHNA.
Well, thank you. It was a very clear answer. You mentioned that if there's a shortfall in cycle 6 at the mid-cycle review, that could result in streamlining provisions based on state law that reduces the discretion of the local jurisdiction. I understand that particular aspect. My question is, if there is a difference in the mix of units in terms of affordable or moderate levels, does that also trigger the same type of streamlining provisions? So let's say, I'm sorry, just one clarification. So let's say we have a 1,000 unit allocation, and let's say 25% of those are supposed to be low or very low. But let's say the mix turns out to be more on the higher end. How does that affect these provisions?
Yeah, great question. State law is pretty detailed about the streamlining provisions. It does depend upon which income categories you're meeting or not meeting, and then also depends upon the features of the project that's being proposed and the level of affordability in the project. So those two things, which numbers you're meeting or not meeting versus characteristics of the project, per state law, tell you what level of discretion you have to review and approve the project.
So the short answer is yes.
The short answer is it depends.
All right, thank you.
Wow, okay. So we are, I know we still have, okay, I'm going to go to the last one back there, and then right afterwards, we're going to take a brief break. I'm going to let you eat, and then you're going to come back, and we are going to still be talking about RHNA, and you'll still be able to answer your questions, and everyone is still going to be in the room. So we'll take one more in the back.
Good afternoon. Greg Wright, Vice Mayor Pacifica. I really appreciate all you're doing to help get some clarity and give us some warning on what's coming. I was wondering, as those additional considerations, if you could educate me on how the challenges coastal communities have in having the additional hurdle of dealing with the Coastal Commission, and how that applies to your consideration for both allotment and resources to get our housing elements going.
So as we covered in the presentation earlier, there will be a heightened need for ABAG to consider factors or methodological changes this cycle, including but not limited to sea level rise. I recognize there are unique challenges on the coast versus the bay. Everyone's trying to plan for that. So that's going to be something that the HMC will have to grapple with. What percentage of the RHNA allocation should be driven by resilience factors, for example? And how does that weigh compared to other considerations like affirmatively furthering fair housing, and access to jobs, which were key aspects of the methodology last time? So I realize, more specific, sorry, go ahead.
Just going through the Coastal Commission process, it just takes more time to get approval for your housing element. It's much harder to build there. There are other challenges in consideration to that, and I'm just wondering how that factors into your decisions when you're making decisions about RHNA allotments and the funding to support us in doing that, since it is much more expensive for a city, especially when 15% of your city is in the coastal zone.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on the concerns about working with the state in that regard. Last cycle, that was not a factor in the RHNA methodology. As mentioned, that we were going to look very thoughtfully about how to incorporate resilience. Perhaps there's different considerations for coastal sea level rise and bayside sea level rise that the HMC can look at, and that's basically what we'll be grappling with in 2027 and 2028. So I appreciate you elevating that concern. We'll be taking a look.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. You have a